Before we start the session on shading, which is hopefully reasonably quick, just want to look at one more thing on mole. And if you log into the module, on the left hand side is the Revit primer. We've touched on it before, but I just want to walk you through it a little bit there. If you click on that area there, first of all is the introduction. So read that document very carefully. That explains what the Revit primer is, what it's for. In essence, the Revit primer is there to help you build your skills in Revit. It's not essential for this module, but I think you'll find it very useful in your further work at the university here, and also as you move out into a career in practice or in academia. If you look into the Revit primer content, then what we've got is a selection of folders covering key topics. Some of those topics you will have already covered in this course. Some of them are new. So for example, let's go into core BIM concepts here. And if you click on the link, it takes you into our online resource, which is lynda.com. You have to log in. It's not accessible outside of the university. It's a paid subscription service that we use. So you can't, it's not something that members of the public can view. Okay, so you have to log in. That will then take you to the selected playlist that I've put together. So the full Revit training course on lynda.com is quite large. But what I've done is I've put you together a series of playlists of relevant, fairly short, relevant information. So for example, here, core BIM concepts, we've got, what have we got? We've got 3 videos for you to watch. 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 7 minutes. So it's about 14 minutes in total. Okay, so it's not, it's not massively time consuming. So the thing to bear in mind is in this module, you have time allocated to self-directed learning, and in that time you're expected to study and develop your learning yourself in your own time. And this is part of that, really. So with some of these videos, you can simply watch the video and learn from the content. So for example, these videos here, which are talking about key BIM concepts, you can just sit and watch them. Quite short. And if you click on the video link, the video will start. We've had a look at this before, but I just want to make sure that you understand. So there's the video. You have the full transcript of what's said in the video. Obviously, you can make that video full screen. Okay, but as I've mentioned before, the thing to be careful about is that the video will automatically move onto the next chapter. So if you're not careful, you'll just endlessly watch video after video. And which is fine if you've got the time, but I would recommend that rather than do that, follow the content through mole. Okay? So go through these chapters and just develop your understanding that way. Okay. Some of it you may find you don't need now, but you might find later on in the course you have an issue. For example, you're making some curtain walls. You can go back and have a look, and it will give you lots of useful guidance. Okay. Any questions on the Revit primer there? Okay, good. I think hopefully make use of it. It's a new resource. Last year on this module, quite often students would come to me and say, you know, Aidan, I want to develop my Revit skills. You've not covered how to make roofs, how to make curtain walling, how to make floor slabs. And, you know, I had to explain that this module is about simulation, and we don't have the time or space to teach you Revit entirely. So we've put this new resource together, which gives you that, hopefully that kind of easy way of developing your Revit skills, and you can do that in your own time and at your own pace. Okay. All right. Let's move into the session proper. So we're talking about integrated shading design and the simulation of shading in a design environment. So really, this session, we're not really learning anything new in terms of skills. We're just using those skills now to think about how we could optimize the shading in our buildings. So I've got a few slides here just to go through, partly just a recap, but a little bit of an understanding about daylight and shading in buildings. Daylighting metrics, quantitative and qualitative, we've talked about. So these two different types. Quantitative, more about kind of numbers, about metrics, about being able to actually put a figure on a daylight performance. Qualitative, much more about quality, about the feel of a space, about how it looks, about maybe kind of, you know, how it enhances the use of that space. What's the connection with the outside? Do you get a lovely shadow pattern? And we need to think about both of these in our building design. Depending on the type of building, you may major more on one or the other. So, for example, if you were designing, let's say, an office environment, you might be more concerned about looking at the quantitative analysis of daylight, making sure the numbers are right. But equally, in an office environment, people work there, and those people want a connection with the outside. They might want a nice, you know, a patch of sunlight, some shadow patterns, that kind of nice quality of daylight. If you were designing, let's say, a church, you might be much more concerned with the kind of quality of daylight and much less about the actual metrics, because in that church environment, people are not working, they're not on a laptop, they're not really writing or reading. And maybe you would think, no, the quality of that space is much more important. So always think about those two factors in your work. Daylight factor we've mentioned. It's a key daylighting metric. We've talked about this before. It's the ratio of the internal light to the external light. It's given in percent, and we use this overcast sky, so that orientation does not have a bearing on daylight factor. And we've looked at this before, the different kinds of sky conditions. So just to recap, from our kind of overcast sky here, where it's the same level of brightness all over, more or less, into a clear sky, which is much brighter where the sun is. A little look at metrics, a little understanding of the number. If the daylight factor in a room is less than 2%, the room looks gloomy. It feels gloomy, it feels dark. Switch those off. You would need full electric lighting all of the time. So even in the middle of the day, you would need to switch the lights on. And the electric lighting would dominate the appearance. So if you took this room right now, as it is, with all of these blinds down, we've probably got a daylight factor of about 1%, would be my guess. 1% probably. And, you know, if we were working in here, we'd probably need to switch the lights on. Even though we've got, you know, it's a reasonably clear, well, It's not that clear, is it? But, you know, we probably need the lights on. So that's kind of anything below 2% really is quite poor in terms of daylight factor. 2 to 5%, the windows give a predominantly daylit appearance, but some supplementary electric lighting may be needed. But generally speaking, 2% to 5% is considered a good quality of daylight, good level of daylight, usually the optimum range of daylighting for overall energy use. So what we mean by that is you're getting a good balance of not allowing too much heat into the building, but equally not needing the lights on all the time during the day. At night time, obviously, you need to put the lights on because it's dark, but in the day we try and minimise that. So generally, 2% to 5% is a really good daylight factor to aim for. At the upper end of that scale, 5% will feel much brighter, much better connection with the outside, and you won't need the lights on as much. 5% or more, the room is strongly daylit. It will feel very well daylit, very bright. And in the daytime, you would rarely need electric lighting. But you can have big thermal problems from heat coming through your windows. So typically, anywhere above 5% daylight factor overall in that space, you probably would start to consider shading, because it's probably too bright, which means you get problems with glare because you've got strong light interfering with the work area. Also, you're probably starting to run the risk of overheating in that space. So bear this in mind in your report, in the section on shading, where you're asked to take one or two of those rooms in the building and optimise the shading. So you're kind of looking for that 2 to 5% generally in that space. Now, that's not to say you can't have some areas that are a little bit brighter than that, but kind of anything above 5% may be too bright. So those are the kind of metrics to think about in your work. Okay, average daylight factor. The mean average is where you take all of the daylight factor readings in that space and you take an average. Okay, now Revit unfortunately is not very helpful in allowing you to do that. For our purposes, I think you can just get an overview by looking at your simulations of that floor plan. Okay. Uniformity ratio is where you take the minimum daylight factor and you divide it by the average daylight factor. And it gives you a sense of have I got really bright parts of that room and then really dark parts? Because obviously having a room which has some really bright areas near the window, but then some really dark areas, is perhaps not the most useful space that you can have. Now, what you can do, sorry, just go back there. In most spaces, you can discount any areas that are used primarily for storage. So, for example, in this room, this area here next to the lockers, we probably would not be concerned about the daylight level because people are not going to work in that area. The minimum point daylight factor is the lowest daylight factor point in that room. And you can get this from Revit by simply looking at your colour-coded simulations and seeing what the lowest daylight factor level is. And for example, in schools, in education, the lowest point that you can have is 0.8%. So nowhere in that room must go below 0.8%. And that's quite a good guide. Generally, if you're allowing parts of your space to go below that sort of 1 to 0.8%, you've got quite dark areas in that room. And this is what I was talking about. The daylight zone is the zone within the room where the daylight criteria must be met, typically about 80%. And that 20% area, circulation, storage, you don't need to worry about. And that's useful because when you're designing a building, as you move away from the windows, it gets darker. And it means that rather than having to perhaps be very concerned with those deeper spaces, as long as there's circulation or storage, that's acceptable. Okay. Let's go into Revit. So, let's have a quick drink. In your sample Revit file, which is on Mole, I'm just going to go into a 3D view here. Okay. There's our site, and there's our sample building sat on that site. I'm just going to switch the shadows off for now. Okay, so there's our building. What we've got in the sample is we've used the design options to try out a few different shading configurations. And in the submission, what you're asked to do is to take one or two rooms within this building and really optimize the daylighting. You're not expected to do that for every room, but just take one room probably and do it quite well. So in the sample file, what I've done, if I go to my floor plan, is I've taken this room here, which is the cafe room at ground floor, which has got lots and lots of glazing, and I've taken that as my start point for the shading design. And as we saw in the previous session, we were starting to simulate that floor. And if we go and quickly look at those results, okay, this one here. This was the sheet that we made in the previous session. Let's just zoom in there a little bit. And this was testing the design without any additional shading. So this was just purely testing full glazing with nothing to block the sun. And bearing in mind that our key, which is over here, is from 0 to 20%, what you could see, in fact I'm just going to drag that over there, what you can see is we're getting, in this zone close to the window, we're getting 20% or more daylight factor. Really, really bright. If we move back into the building, this red area is still in the 10 to 14% daylight factor. And the green here is in the sort of 6 to 8% daylight factor. So really, as an initial simulation, I think what that tells us quite clearly is we've got excessive daylight in this space. Now, it's a cafe, so we're perhaps not quite so worried about glare, but bearing in mind that people nowadays in cafes like to sit with their laptop, their iPad, read the paper, people like to work in cafes, I think we need to control that daylighting. I think the concern as it stands is you could go into that space and it's so bright that you can't work. You just can't use it. Equally, it's quite likely with all that radiation from the sun that space will overheat. It will probably be far too hot. Now, at this stage in the design, what you could also do is run the energy analysis for the building. And we showed that in a previous session. I haven't got time to cover that now. run the energy analysis, use that as a benchmark for your start point with the design. So how much energy are you using with this unshaded design? Okay, we then are at the stage where we've got some simulation results and we move into a phase of adapting the design, testing, and then iterating. So we kind of change the design, test it, then we go back, we make more changes, we test it again until we get to a point where we're quite happy with the results. Okay. Now we also, this morning we looked at how you create shadow patterns, if I can find that. Oh, that's not the right one. Anyway, we showed you this morning. Is that? No, that's not it either. This one, yeah. So we looked at how you create a real shadow pattern. So again, sorry. As we saw with this, we can also, for that space, cycle through the sun path different times of the year, and again get a feel for how much sunlight are we getting. Okay. In your report, you should record that. Record that as a kind of base design option, the sort of unshaded base design. Now, let's now look at how we can start to change and shade that space. Okay, let me go back into our 3D view, which is this one. Now, I think one of the first questions that you could ask yourself is, have we got too many windows? So before you start shading glass, maybe you look at that building and think, perhaps we don't need all of that glazing. So if we look at the ground level here, we've got a lot of glazing, lots and lots of glazing. But equally, you need to make decisions about how the building is used. Now, because this building is a cafe at ground floor, when I say designing this building, it's not really meant to be a finished design, but when I was putting this building together, my initial idea was more that we'd want that really good visual connection between the plaza and the interior. And as you probably know, if you go to a cafe, you like to watch people like to see if their friends are inside. If you're the business running that cafe, you certainly want customers to look in, see what you're selling, how much is coffee, what's it look like, is it really busy, shall I go in? So there are other reasons why you might decide that yes, we do want lots of glass, because we want that visual connection. But, equally, in this model, if you want to change the size and the shape of the windows, you can do that, and you can test it. Okay, but when I was playing with the shade, with the daylight, I left the windows largely as they were. Equally, if we just look around the building, there are some rooms which perhaps don't have enough windows. And if we look at the level 11 plan, some students last year did analyse this space here. And what I've done with this space, this seminar room on the first floor, is I've kind of deliberately not put enough windows in it. So when you look at this space, you've got that one window there, nothing else for the rest of that room. Some of the reports last year analysed that space, and they added more windows to that space because they felt the daylight factor was too low. Okay. Just close that. go back to our 3D model. Okay. What we've got in this sample file is we've used the design options to place different shading configurations into different design options. And we talked about design options earlier on. You go to the Manage tab, Design Options here. Okay, and under Design Options, this is where you can create new options where you could add shading, for example. And what you'll see we've got here is we've got option 1A, 1B, 1C, and 1D. So I've created a few different shading arrangements, put them into different options. That is a much neater way of working rather than creating shading, deleting it, moving it, deleting it. Much better to put it in design options. Okay, just a quick recap on design options. What catches people out is if you go VV and you click on the design options, what is a little bit confusing, you can override the design option in the view. So you could be actively editing design option B, but if it's set incorrectly, you could be viewing option D. So the easiest thing is to set that to automatic. So set your design option views to automatic. That generally is the easiest way of working. Now, if I just zoom in now, what we will now see is we'll see the active design option. So if I go into option 1A, that one doesn't have any additional shading, that's right. If I go into option 1B, we see that version of the shading, which is some kind of external horizontal louvers. If I go into option 1C, we've got an option with much more shading on it. And option, I can't remember what, 1D, if I just zoom out a bit. So 1A is our option without any additional shading. 1B, we add that shading on, but we're leaving every other window open. 1C adds. So if you look down here on the south elevation of the building, in 1B we've got these 4 shading devices. In 1C we add these additional shades, and 1D just seems to be a slight variation on that. Okay. Now what you can do yourselves, if I go to a floor plan, I'm going to switch the shadows off here. What's quite an easy way of working is if you're in, for example, option 1D, even without needing a sort of high level of Revit ability, it's very easy to select one of those shades and just delete it and test it like that. Equally, it's very easy to pick up that shade and use our copy command, copy that, click, drag, and you've copied it. If I just go to a 3D view, actually, let me just tidy up a bit. So if I just undo there, so we are in option 1D here. So keep an eye on the 3D view. Very easy to select that element, delete it, select an element, copy it. Okay, so even without needing to be really sort of expert at Revit, you've got enough in that sample file for you to start to play around with your own shading configuration. Okay, I'm just going to undo that. Okay. So, you've got your options. The next stage is to start to assess and simulate those options. And there are a number of ways that you can do that. What you might find, the first stage, is if you open... So we opened, this was the view that we created this morning with a camera showing the realistic shadows. So the first thing you could do would be maybe just to simply switch on and off these different shading types. And maybe use that just to get a kind of first impression of how much shading are we getting? Visually, is that right? Maybe you might zoom in and you might think there might be some kind of quality aspect there that you like. Maybe that sort of pattern of shadow is quite pleasing on the eye. So that's quite a good one. You could then run a solar study. So if we go into sun settings, as we did before, single day, let's try spring equinox. Let's go from 8 o'clock in the morning through to 6 o'clock in the evening. Okay. And let's preview our solar study. So we go back to 8 o'clock in the morning, and we can move that sun around. Okay, get a feel for that. You might find there's something really you really like about that shading device. Very quick to then change that to a different shading configuration. Okay, like that. So we're getting some very quick feedback on our design. You might change the change that to, let's change that to summer. Okay. Let's go from, again, 8 o'clock in the morning. And in summer, let's go through till 8 o'clock in the evening. And again, we can immediately see that how that shading will work in summer when the sun is much higher. We're not getting those really low shadows. Okay? So that's something very quick. And we've gone through the tools this morning about how you can export those images. Great. Really kind of simple. Okay. Next stage possibly would be to change this back to a still. And let's go for spring equinox. Okay. And do a daylight factor render. So render in the cloud as we did before. Change it to illuminance. Change your size. Sky model. Daylight factor. Legend. Let's stick with our 0 to 20 for now. Okay. Start rendering. Okay. What you might also be interested in doing is render an illuminance study. So the same view, illuminance, change the size, sky model. Let's try a different sky. How about we look at how about we look at a clear sky? Let's have a look at this. What date? I can't remember what date this was, but let's try it with a clear sky. Legend. We don't want foot candles because that's American. We want lux, which is the unit we want. Let's change our scale from 0 to 2000. Start rendering. Off it goes. Okay. And really, this is the kind of benefit now, because you've done all the work, that it's very quick to now simulate and test your results. Let's go to a 3D view inside. In fact, let's just for speed, let's just place a new camera. So view, 3D view, camera. Place a camera in that room. There's our view. Okay, let's just expand that view a little bit. Switch the shadows on. And again, we could do a solar study. Let's do a spring equinox solar study. Yeah. Okay. Zoom in a bit there. Preview the solar study. And now we can preview through the day what that shadow pattern looks like from a sort of perspective view. Again, we can render that in the cloud. We could do that as we could do it as a still image or as an illuminance. Let's do that as a daylight factor. Use the date from the view, sky model, daylight factor, legend. Let's go 0 to 20%. Start rendering. Okay. So we're able now to very quickly start to build up a picture of the different options that we're testing. Now, until we get those results back from the cloud, we don't know how those options are performing. And what I would also be doing here is, let's just do it quickly, analyze. I won't do it now, it'll take too long. But also, run the energy analysis. So for each of these design options, run an energy analysis simulation. Run energy simulation. I won't do it now because it won't be finished in time. But and test. What you might find is that as you add more shading, probably the cooling load will come down significantly. So you might be able to demonstrate that not only are you making those spaces better in terms of daylight, but also you're not needing to use so much energy to cool the building down. Now, I'm not going to go through all of that, but I think at this stage in the simulation process and the design process, you've got lots of different skills and you need to kind of bring them together. All these different types of simulation, daylight, shadow, energy, and use that to demonstrate how you can optimize this shading. Okay. Also, visualization. Never forget that concept about, well, what does the space look like? What do I want? Do I want really interesting shadows? Or am I happy just to sort of block out the sun? That's a decision as a designer that you have to make. So I'm going to go back into our render gallery. Let's see if any of those have come through yet. I just refreshed that. Okay, so they're not... oh, that one's finished, I think. Oh, it's not. So it's not quite finished. But this was our daylight factor simulation with some of the additional shading, and I mean I think you can already begin to see that we are bringing that daylight level down a little bit by adding that shading. Equally, if you look at the room over here, you might comment that this is actually quite dark here in the depths of this room. Okay. The other ones they're not finished yet, but that's the kind of process. The other thing that I mentioned last week, just go back into here, was about putting in some furniture. Okay. You'll find it's what we, as I mentioned, it's what we call dressing the scene. You will find that your internal renderings and visualizations are much more convincing when you've dressed the scene. So when you've put some furniture in, maybe put some light fittings, make it feel like a real space, and you will just, I think you'll be surprised at how much more convincing those renderings are. At the moment, the sample model just has a few, not much. It's got a few sofas in it, but you can add further elements yourself. Okay, so this one is coming through. Now, that says to me that I've made a mistake here. Well, we should let it finish actually, but if you get a result like this and everything is all yellow, what that normally means is you set your key, you set your legend wrong. I suspect what I've got here is, this was probably my illuminance study, so not a cloudy sky, but I think this is our clear sky, and I'm not sure, but I suspect I've set the range from 0 to 20 lux by mistake. Now, that's more than 20 lux on my hand already. So I think what I've done is I've probably just made that mistake so that everything in that room is above 20 lux. So, it doesn't matter, you can just go and resend it, but I guess that's what's happened there. Okay, the other one's not ready yet. Okay, so really what I wanted to show you today was all the different ways that you can start to now simulate and optimize those spaces. I'm not showing you a kind of prescribed methodology, so I'm not telling you you should do this simulation first, then this simulation, then this. I'm leaving that to you to develop. You've got the skills now. You can look at the sample submissions from previous years on Mole, and you can look at how other students have approached this, and bearing in mind that all those submissions are really good submissions. They're all in the sort of high B to A grade, so if they're there, that's good work. And what I want you to do in your submission is really find your own kind of way in this aspect. How do you want to simulate? Do you want to prioritize views over shading? Do you want to have shading which perhaps blocks out summer sunshine only, but doesn't block out winter sunshine? I mean, what I've got here, in this example, this shading is very effective at blocking out high level and low level, and I left these gaps in between it. Now, for a cafe, that's probably okay, because if you go to a cafe and there's a patch of sunlight where you're sitting, you can always just move. If this was a work environment, you might say that's not a good approach. Okay, so really I want you to put some of your own kind of understanding and application into how you approach the shading design. Okay? Any questions on shading design and simulation? Okay, great. So, as usual, we've covered quite a lot. Okay, you've got lots and lots to look at now. As I said earlier, you've got about 5 weeks to develop your report. Hopefully you've started and you're not starting from scratch. Okay? Have a go. Okay? Start working on it. If you've got problems, come and ask me. Okay? The submission is open on Mole. So if you finish the report, you can submit it this afternoon if you like. Okay? But you don't get any extra points for submitting early. All right? All the instructions are there on Mole. I mean, the other thing that hopefully you'll find really exciting is being able to now take these skills and use them in other areas of your study. Studio work, if you're taking a studio module, analysis. Some students last year used some of these skills in the building physics module. Hopefully you find it a really kind of empowering set of skills that you take forward and ultimately you take into your future careers. Okay. Any questions before we stop? Okay, great. So, send me an email if you want to see me. I'm not arranging formal tutorials. I leave it for you to, you tell me what you need. If somebody might need 5 appointments with me, somebody might need none. That's completely up to you, but let me know. Okay, thanks very much.